Hey everyone, this is Vanessa Chase Lokshin. I hope you're doing well. We're going to get started here momentarily. I know a few of you are still joining, so I'll give everyone just a minute or so to get started. Yeah, so hang tight. We'll get started momentarily. I'm really glad so many of you are here today. Okay. All right. Um, okay. Cool. So, all right. So let's continue on here. Hi everyone. As I was mentioning a few minutes ago, my name is Vanessa Chase Lokshin. I'm sure lots of you probably know me from the storytelling nonprofit and through nonprofit fundraising and communications work. So glad you're all here. So I've been doing lunchtime hangouts on and off probably since like last summer, and it's always been such a fun opportunity just to connect with people, to answer questions you all have about fundraising, about storytelling, and about other things that you might be working on, and to also just share with you some of the things that I'm working on and tell you a little bit about some of the new insights I've had on storytelling and new thoughts that I've been working on with regards to that. So I'm super happy to have everyone here. And I'm going to try doing these every Wednesday through March just to see how they go and see if it's something that all of you are interested in. So if you do enjoy this today, and I hope you do, be sure to mark your calendar the same time every Wednesday now through the end of March. We'll be live on Google Hangouts doing these. And if for some reason you can't make it, I will also be putting the recordings up on the blog probably the day after, so on Thursday each week. So you can also check those out as well. So this week, we're going to go for about a half hour, so till 12:30 Pacific, which should be 2:30 Central and 3 p.m. Eastern. So I'm going to start with just kind of a quick short lesson on something related to storytelling, and then we'll do some Q&A. So if you have questions you would like me to answer, feel free to put them on the events page, which is probably where a lot of you are watching the event right now. You can go on over there. There's a chat box. You'll see there's already some comments there, which is great. And if you're listening in, would love to have you say hello, tell us where you're listening in from. It's always fun to see where everyone's coming from on the event. So start thinking of questions. You can put them in there, and I'll be getting to those probably in about 10 minutes or so. So I see lots of you are still signing on, which is great. So what do I want to talk about today? So last week I wrote a blog post that a lot of people left some really wonderful comments on, and I wanted to kind of talk about it some more. So the post was called How to Tell Stories with Emotions and Details. And if you're interested in reading the full thing, you can go over to thestorytellingnonprofit.com and click on the blog, and you'll be able to find it there. So I wrote this post because I often see people get really hung up with this question of how do I tell a good story? And I think there's a lot of ways to answer that question, certainly. And I have lots of advice on that. But I think that like one of the biggest things that I see people really struggle with is the emotions and details piece. So I always think about stories as being facts told with emotions and details. That's kind of how I've come to understand stories more recently. You know, it's a series of chronological things that happen, and we're just adding in emotions and details, which make it a really rich, interesting story. And that takes it from being just a series of facts to an actual story itself. So when I was teaching a workshop last week in Alabama for AFP Alabama, I I gave the example of, you know, I could tell all of you that when I was 17, I moved to Canada, which is true. And I moved here to go to university. And that's really not that interesting of a story, right? To say like I moved here when I was 17, I went to school here, and I've stayed here ever since. So that's, you know, a story in and of itself. It's a series of facts. But if I told you, you know, I moved here when I was 17, I had never been to Canada before. I didn't know anyone who lived in the country, and moving here was, you know, something I was really looking forward to, and I was actually really excited about it until my mom left me at the school dorm building, and all of a sudden I had this like sheer amount of panic rush over me where I was like, oh, I'm alone here. I don't know anyone. It's really scary. I felt very alone and very isolated. So as you can see, as I start to add in those details to that story, that makes it a little bit more potentially interesting for some of you. So that's, ideally what we're doing when we're telling stories anytime on behalf of our organizations or about ourselves is we're adding in the emotions and details piece. So how do we go about doing this? So one of the things that I do when I'm going through this process with someone or going through it myself is I kind of start by listing out just the facts. And so I'll write them all down. So just like I just told you, for instance, there's a couple of facts about myself. I'll just write them down. I'll just kind of make a mind map or a list, and I'll just get them written down so that I can see the basic things that are happening there. And then once I have those facts written down, what I do next is I go in and I think about, okay, what are some of the details? And so then I go through and I start brainstorming details that I remember. It could be sensory details. It could be, chronological details that I remember, things about the environment, about me, about other people, really anything. And I brainstorm as many of those as I possibly can. And then I go through, once I've done that, and I brainstorm in the emotional pieces. How was I feeling? What was it? What did it feel like when, fill in the blank, when something happened or when something occurred? And so that's kind of the process I go through to kind of filter in through these different layers of a story where we get the facts and we understand the conceptual, factual information. And then we want to add in these additional emotions and details pieces, which are so, so important, right? Those are the pieces that really make that story come alive. So I want to suggest that if you are having trouble with that, or if you look at some of the stories that you've written or maybe told in the last couple of months and you're like, oh, like they're kind of flat, they could use a little something to jazz them up. It's probably going to be the emotions and detail piece that's missing or that just needs to be improved or tweaked somehow. So go back and think about, in those stories, what could you do differently? What else could you add in with regards to those pieces, the emotions and details piece? It doesn't often have to be a lot. Sometimes it's just a couple of key details that really make that story very vivid and vibrant and to, as I said, kind of come alive for other people. That's what we're going for. And as you're doing that process, there's a couple of things that I would think about as well. So especially with regards to the emotional detail piece, which I find is something that people generally have the most difficulty with because, it's sometimes hard to put a finger on or name the emotion we were experiencing during a particular time. So what you can do with that is think about, this question of how was I feeling when, or how were you feeling when, and, fill in the blank, when something happened or whatever that might be. Or what's another question I like to ask? Those are both questions I like to consider. But asking those, I find, often helps get people to really start thinking about the emotional qualities of the experience and putting them back into that space where they were at when they experienced it themselves. And so that can be a really great way to just kind of tap into that a little bit more. I think the other thing that I often do, there's a couple of exercises I would suggest around that. So that's one of them, asking that question, how did it feel when? If I'm doing it for myself, sometimes free writing or journaling around that particular event can help evoke some of the feelings that I was feeling at that time and help me remember them so that I can then, tell them in a story. And I can work with someone on that as well, asking them to kind of write for a minute or two or to kind of think about or talk me through what was happening can often help them kind of back into what they were feeling at that time or remember it, so to speak. So those are a couple of things you can do. I always think of the process of telling stories or helping other people tell their stories as being one where we're really kind of being a guide. We're coming alongside them, right? Like, we know they have a story to tell and we want them to tell that story. And we need to just kind of empower people with the tools, the right questions to be able to tell that story really well. And for me, this process of thinking about the facts, the details, and the emotions has often been a really great tool to kind of lead someone through that process for themselves. And, there's other things you can also do too, just asking questions, having conversations. But for me, that's been one that's consistently worked very well. And I wanted to share that with you today in case some of you were thinking about what else could we do differently around our stories. How else can we, really improve them quite significantly? And what are some easy changes to make around that? So really honing in on the details and emotions is my suggestion for that. I hope it's helpful. And I'm happy to talk about this a little bit more, but I do want to get to answering some questions. So for those of you who are listening into the live broadcast right now, I'm happy to answer questions related to this or anything else on storytelling and fundraising. So you can go ahead and go over to the event page, which is probably where you're watching this right now. And you can type in your questions in the chat box. And I'll start to give people a couple minutes to do that, and then we'll start answering some questions. In the meantime, what do I want to tell you? One of the questions that I often get asked around stories, especially with interviewing, is what do I do if someone doesn't want to talk, or they have a really hard time telling me what happened? Or, if you're working with a child or a teenager and, they're just not very chatty, right? And you're like, okay, how do I get all this information from them so that I can then go on to, tell it in a story, which is I feel like that's the perennial challenge for a lot of people, is how do we get, these people's stories talking a little bit more? So I wanted to answer that question because I think it's a really good one and something worthwhile thinking about. There's a couple of things. I mean, one, making sure that people feel really comfortable is key, right? We want to make sure that they're in an environment they feel safe in, that they, feel okay in. It's not something new and unfamiliar or jarring to them. That's really key to think about. So whatever we can do to kind of create that for people is really helpful, I think. So if they would prefer to meet in their home versus meeting at your office, go to them instead. I find when I interview kids or teenagers, sometimes doing something with them can be a really great way to engage them more in conversation rather than just like sitting across from them at a table and asking questions. So for instance, if I know they're involved with a program at the organization, volunteering so that I can then talk to them and engage with them while they're doing that activity can be a really great way to start that conversation and to make sure that, there's lots of opportunity to ask questions and get to know them a little bit more, can be really helpful. Let's see, another thing that I like to do as well, and similarly with adults is, who just are feeling really awkward about the whole interviewing situation, is to get people moving. So go for a walk, kind of get the conversation flowing in a different way. Sometimes it can just be really helpful to talk about something totally unrelated to an experience that someone had. So think about what else you could do, what else you could talk about, what other interests they have to kind of get their mind off of it and kind of help build rapport with the person first, before you kind of dive into some of those other questions or talking about a topic that might be a little bit more difficult. So that's something that you can definitely do as well, that I think is often very helpful in the process. So those are a couple of tips. Yeah, definitely, getting people moving, getting them in an environment where they feel comfortable, asking them, or engaging with them on something totally unrelated can also be helpful as well, to get them talking and get them thinking about things. Okay. So I want to answer some questions. I haven't seen any come in yet. So for those of you who are listening in, would love to answer your questions. Feel free to send them in. I think there's also a Q&A function, which you'll see on the broadcast. You can type them in there, and they'll show up as you type them in, which should be awesome. Love to help you out with this. Let's see. So what are some other questions I can answer while we're sitting here? And another question too is, what if someone's been through something really traumatic, and how do we work with them around, telling their story without hopefully re-traumatizing them through that process? That can be really challenging. And I think that that's a situation, if you're working kind of like a social work setting or a situation where you have counselors on staff who can support that person, or who have worked with that person over a period of time, that can be a really great resource to tap into, asking them, what do you think, how can I best support this person? Or can you help us work through this process of telling their story? And that person, the counselor or social worker, may actually say, I don't know if they're ready for this. And that's a really good professional opinion to have. It's good to think about, getting those opinions, getting some additional support, figuring out, how you can best help people tell their stories without re-traumatizing them. So if you do have resources or staff like that, who can, answer those questions or talk through with you, who is a good candidate for telling the story, that can often be really great. I think that was a big concern when I worked at a social service agency years ago. We had men and women who graduated from an alcohol and drug recovery program. And so it was always really challenging to know, if it was the right time or right opportunity for someone to tell their story about their process of, getting to sobriety, which is a big thing. So that was a, something we would work with our counselors on. We'd have lots of conversation before we would ever actually get around to working with them on that story. Okay. Great. So I see a question here that came up. So the question is, if your organization is focused on one type of client, any tips for keeping the same story fresh? Okay, great. Yeah, good question. Okay, so I love this question because this is one of the things that a lot of us are coming up against, right? We have kind of a same story that we want to tell over and over again, or, we want to kind of engage with making sure that people really understand the work. And if you think about it, one of the key things that we're often doing is we're telling stories about our mission, right? We want to tell stories about the work we're doing. So really, at the base of all the stories we have, the kind of common through line is that they are stories about our mission, which can be kind of perceived as like the same story, but we're telling them in different ways, right? We're highlighting different clients, we're talking about different angles, that sort of thing. So I think when it comes to telling client stories, though, especially if you're talking about, making sure that people kind of are familiar with the clients that you're serving, the people that you help, a couple of thoughts on that. So one, everyone does have a unique story, even though they may have arrived at the same endpoint. So for instance, the example I was just giving, all of our clients at that organization arrived at the same point. They became sober, right? Which technically, we were telling the same story over and over again, stories about people becoming sober and going through a recovery program for addictions. But what was really unique about that story was, often the challenges that before they entered the recovery program. So what was their life like before they did that? And getting into those nuanced details that were very unique to that person made the stories all feel very different. And we were able to talk about a lot of different people and their stories and their backgrounds. And, that really highlighted that, addictions, don't discriminate, right? People anywhere, anytime can really struggle with that issue. And so that was one thing that worked really well. Other things that you can do, you can tell the client story from different perspectives, right? So you could have the client tell the story first person, but there are other people around them who can also be good people to tell that story as well. So it might be, other staff members who know them. It might be volunteers who know them. It might be their family members, other people who are just kind of around them who can also speak to the transformation or change that they've gone through. They can also be really good people to highlight and to have tell those stories as well. And again, it can really, that storytelling can still speak to the impact that you're trying to show, probably if you're telling a client story, but it'll be a different voice, it'll be a different perspective. And especially if you find that there's like one or two key types of stories you want to tell, having those different perspectives can be really helpful to keep things fresh, to make sure people see all the people who are involved in this effort, that it's not just the client, there's people that support them, staff and volunteers, donors, all these other people. And so being able to kind of talk to that, I think, can be really powerful. Let's see what else. Yeah, I think that's probably my biggest tip, is remembering that people are all unique, as cliche as that sounds. And so all of your stories will be very different. I think that the key to getting to that kind of the differences and the nuances in the stories is asking questions and really getting to know people, getting to know their backstory so that you can tell more of that. So that it's not just this before and after story. You can really tell the details about the before, and really help paint a vivid picture for people about what that person's life was like and what sort of change they really experienced. All right, so I hope that's helpful. I'm glad that someone asked that question, and I'll try to think if I have any other tips on that. All right, so another question here from Danielle, and the question is, how can you tell a story without names or faces because of client confidentiality? Great question. So there's a couple of ways you can go about doing that. And I worked with several organizations over the years who also have that as a big challenge. You want to tell stories about people that you're helping, but you work with a vulnerable population, perhaps children, adults who have been through something really traumatic or very severe. Maybe you are a hospital and you're dealing with HIPAA, which is another, confidentiality barrier that we're dealing with. So one of the first things I always like to remind people about confidentiality and around this issue is that we often make the cardinal assumption that people want to remain anonymous or that they don't want their story told. And I see this happen especially at hospitals around HIPAA. So one of the things I would tell you is that if that's your operating assumption, if that's why you think you have to tell stories without faces and names, start asking people, start talking to them. Would you want to be identified with this story? Would it be okay if we did? Under what circumstances would it be okay? And really have those conversations first, rather than making the assumption that people would want to be anonymous in their storytelling. So that's good advice I offer to most people who deal with this. But if the truth or the fact remains that they do want to remain anonymous, that's not a big deal. There's a couple of ways around that. So first of all, with names, using a pseudonym can be very helpful. And you can make a note about this in whatever story you're telling. You can say something like, the name has been changed to protect our client's identity due to the nature of what they've been through. And people are very understanding about that, right? It's not a mystery that if someone is going through something tough, that they might want to remain anonymous. That's okay. That doesn't mean that the story is any less true. And you can make that very apparent to people in telling it. In terms of faces, you can use stock photographs instead. And you can, have captions underneath, that say something like, kids playing, kids doing activities like they would be during our program, or things that are kind of a little bit more general like that. And I would say that 9 times out of 10 people are very understanding about the fact that, we do have to respect confidentiality and privacy and all those things. So don't feel like you can't tell stories if you're dealing with that. There are definitely ways around it. One, as I said, ask people if they are okay being public about telling their story. I think you'll find that many people are. And if they are, have them sign a release or some sort of formal paper, just to kind of have that legal piece out of the way. That's an important part. And then also, if they don't want to have their name or face out there, think about things you could do to accommodate them. So a pseudonym, using stock photographs, lots of ways to work around that. Those are 2 ones that I would definitely think about. And beyond names and faces, sometimes people will get a little nervous, especially about the details of their story that might make them identifiable. So if you find that someone, has certain things that have happened to them that would be easy to, make it easy to identify them as it being, their story, think about what you could do to change some of those details. That's also okay if you're doing that. I think that it's important to still have those stories told. And if the details are not, going to really radically change the story itself, think about what you can do to kind of amend those a little bit. Okay. Great, I hope that's helpful, Daniel. All right, so another question here from Erin, and Erin asks, how can you coach program and other staff members to be storytellers so that all are speaking with the same voice but in different contexts? Okay, so I think I understand your question, Erin. So if not, you can let me know and I'll clarify. So I think your question is about how we can kind of train them so that they have a similar organizational voice and so that's not radically different. So there's kind of like some consistency in communication. I think that that's what you're asking. If it's not, let me know and I'll answer the question that you're actually asking. So I think one of the things around coaching staff and program members is that it does take time and energy to do that. And one of the things that I've seen with people who speak at events is that, you have to work with event speakers in order to get them to a place where they're really polished and really doing really well in their event, in their story delivery at an event. So if you want people to be more consistent in how they're telling stories, you've got to provide them with the training and tools for it. It's kind of like the same dilemma that I see people face with boards and fundraising, where they say, oh, I want my board to fundraise. Why are they not fundraising? And, they'll say to the board members, you need to fundraise. And then then they'll come back like a month later and be like, why haven't you fundraised anything? And the board's like, well, I don't know where to start. I don't know what to do. And it's kind of the same with storytelling, right? People need direction. they need support. They need help figuring out what to do. What are those things that you want them to do? So the more that you can provide them with direction and clarity around what you're looking for, the better. So that might be something like, giving them like a little business-sized card that has like a couple of key talking points or key things to note about telling stories. And maybe you give them a card, once a month that has a new story to tell or a story you want them to highlight when they're out in the community. Empowering them with little tools like that can often make a big difference. It can also be helpful to talk to people one-on-one, answer questions, address concerns, things like that. Really, anything you can do to support them is always helpful, I find. So the best thing you can do is, I think, start by asking people, how can I support you in this thing that I want you to do? And explain to them what it is you're looking for from them. And really ask them for their feedback. How could you best help them through that process? I think you'll get a lot of really good feedback directly from them. And hopefully things that will be really useful as you try to figure out how to best empower your staff to be kind of consistent storytellers for your organization, Erin. So that is my answer to your question. I hope that's helpful. If it was not the right answer that you were looking for, let me know, and I will answer the question that you'd actually like me to answer. Okay, so I know we're kind of coming up to 12:30, and I said we were going to keep this to about a half hour. So I just want to say thank you so much to all of you who are here today and all of you who are watching later on. So happy to have you here. As I mentioned, we'll be doing this again next week as well. It'll be on Wednesday, March 9th, and I'll just put a link here in our platform so that you can, oops, that's not what I want to do. That's not what I want to do at all. I will put it over on the events page if you're interested. Link to next week's event. Hangout, yeah. So it'll be on Wednesday, March 9th, and I'd love for all of you to join me again if you're interested. I will have another kind of mini lesson around storytelling that I would be happy to share with all of you, and definitely be answering some questions as well. And I'll also let you know as well that we're currently taking pre-orders for my book that's coming out on April 1st. So any of you who are interested in learning more about storytelling or having kind of a handy reference guide at your desk all the time, definitely think about purchasing it. If you purchase before March 31st, there's $150 in bonus items and training that come with it, which is great. All you need to do is go over to the Storytelling Nonprofit/book. And if you go over to the storytellingnonprofit.com, you'll also see a link there as well. So lots of great things coming up. I'll be hosting another one of these Hangouts next Wednesday. Hope to see you there. And if you have any special requests for topics that you'd like me to touch on next week, do let me know. I'd love to be able to give you some content that's really relevant. And you can let me know on the event page in the comments. You'll see there's kind of a place where you can leave questions, feedback, anything like that. Love to have you do that. And again, would love to make sure that these are super valuable times for all of you who are here. So thanks so much, everyone, for being here. I hope you have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Take care.